So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the Detroit Lions have to make some roster cuts themselves, as well as every other team around the NFL has until 4 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon to make their final roster cuts and trim their roster from 90 players all the way down to 15. The Detroit Lions, along with every other team in the NFL, is going to have quite a few tough decisions to make, and today I am here to give you what I believe the 53-man roster should be, as well as the 16-man practice squad going into the 2023 season. Now, prior to this video being made, the Detroit Lions have already cut and waived several people. Now, taking a look at the list so far, not too many big names on here, not too many surprises. However, the Detroit Lions have officially released 5 members already, that being Christian Covington, the veteran defensive tackle, Bobby Hart, the offensive lineman, Jermaine Ifedi, the former first-round offensive tackle of the Seattle Seahawks, as well as Jason Moore, who signed in the absence of Jameson Williams and a couple of the other receivers going down, as well as Devine Ozigbo, a player that led the Detroit Lions in rushing in week 1 of the preseason, has officially not made the roster. Now, the Lions have officially waived a couple other players. Those players include Trinity Benson, Avery Davis, Obini Azie, Daniel Helm, Alex Mollett, Scott Nelson, Darren Paulo, as well as Colby Richardson. Now, the Detroit Lions have the opportunity to bring these guys back, as well as other players to bring back after they clear waivers, but they are going to the waiver wire for the next 24 hours, and teams will have the ability to bid on these players with their waiver wire bids, and of course, potentially take players away from the Detroit Lions. I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of these players return, but as of right now, they are not Detroit Lions. Now, after the graphic was made, another player has officially been waived. That being Dylan Drummond, the undrafted rookie free agent from Eastern Michigan, has officially been waived as well. Didn't have the greatest preseason in as far as game played, but did have a really, really impressive camp and is absolutely loved by the teammates and coaches. I would absolutely expect him to be returning to the Detroit Lions on the practice squad, but for the time being, he is currently waived from the Lions. So with that being said, let's take a look at this roster. Let's take a look at what this roster is going to look like, who's going to start, who's going to back up, who's going to be the depth, and which players are going to miss the cut. Starting off with the quarterback position, Jared Goff officially will be the quarterback 1, as everybody probably knows, but I believe Teddy Bridgewater will be QB2, with Adrian Martinez being that reserve third quarterback, right? Nate Sudfeld officially this morning, it was announced that he tore his ACL in the 3rd game of the preseason, meaning he will likely be done for the entirety of the season. He was placed on IR, tore his ACL, and likely will not be a member of the active roster, but will remain a member of the Detroit Lions on their IR list, while Hendon Hooker likely spends most of the year on the NFL list. The non-football injury list is a list for players that were hurt outside of the NFL. That includes Hendon Hooker, and if he does make it to week 1 with him being on the list, which it is very expected for them to do based off of Adam Schefter's reports, he will remain as such for likely the entirety of the season. Not too many big moves at quarterback, but I think with the injury of Nate Sudfeld, I do believe Adrian Martinez will officially make the roster as technically their 54th player, that being, of course, the 3rd string quarterback. Now, taking a look at running backs, again, pretty cut and dry here. David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs are, of course, going to make this roster. David Montgomery, the free agent from this past offseason, and Jahmyr Gibbs, the first-round selection from Alabama. I think it's pretty obvious that Craig Reynolds is going to make this roster as the RB3. Looked really good versus Carolina. I think can carry the load in the absence of Montgomery or Gibbs for at least a game or two. And then I think this is the year that Jamar Jefferson gets his opportunity. Looked really good in week 2 versus the Jaguars. Didn't play in week 3 or week 1, but he's a player the Lions really, really like. His only other competition thus far is Benny Snell, who I do think will make the practice squad. You could potentially flip them around with Benny Snell being the running back 4, being more the goal line Jamal Williams replacement, but I do think think that they're going to give the slight edge to Jamar Jefferson if he is healthy enough to play in week 1. Moving on to the tight ends. Tight end, there's only a couple tight ends left on the roster as Daniel Helm was officially released today. That leaves Sam Laporta, Brock Wright, and James Mitchell as your 3 tight ends. All 3 of them will likely make the roster as the Lions really like to use their tight ends, and Jared Goff loves them as security blankets, with Shane Zylstra unfortunately being placed on injured reserves and likely staying there for a majority of next season. Now, getting on to the fun stuff. Wide receiver. Amon-Ra St. Brown will, of course, make the roster alongside Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds, and Marvin Jones. But I do believe the Detroit Lions bring in 2 rookies, that being 7th round pick Antoine Green, the wide receiver from North Carolina, as well as undrafted rookie free agent Chase Cota. Who led the Detroit Lions in receptions this preseason, as well as being second in yards only behind Antoine Green in his 97-yard performance in the preseason finale. Now, Jameson Williams will be on the roster, of course, but he won't count against the roster until week 7, as he is officially suspended by the NFL due to violating their gambling policies. As much as we don't like it as Lions fans, that is the reality, and Jameson Williams is not a member of this team until week 7. I think week 1, the Lions go in with St. Brown, Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Jones, Antoine Green, and Chase Cota as your starting 6. Offensive line. Couple big surprises here. Obviously, Taylor Decker will be your starting left tackle. Jonah Jackson will be your starting left guard. Frank Ragnow will be your starting center, with Vaitai being the right guard and Sewell being the right tackle. I do believe that Graham Glasgow will either start over Vaitai or be kind of the jack of all trades backup, right? He can play guard on either side. He can play center if Frank Ragnow happens to go down. I think that clears up the entirety of your interior offensive line if one of your starters does get hurt. On the other side, I think that Colby Sorsdale, the 5th round pick from William and Mary, is going to make the roster as well. I think that he played pretty good in camp. He played pretty good in the preseason. I think it would be pretty silly for the Detroit Lions to let go of their 5th round pick before ever giving him a season to develop or prove himself. I think Colby Sorsdale's spot is pretty secure, as is Matt Nelson. Matt Nelson is the veteran tackle that has started for the Detroit Lions in the past. Didn't have an exceptional preseason, but didn't do bad enough to lose his starting spot either. And then I do believe the Detroit Lions are going to keep Connor Galvin. With the offensive line cuts that they've already made, it seems as though Connor Galvin has already beat out Jermaine Ifedi as well as Bobby Hart for the tackle position. He beat out Abeni Izzy. That essentially makes him the backup left tackle, with Matt Nelson likely being the backup right tackle. I don't think they're going to want to move Connor Galvin from left to right. I think they're going to want to keep him exactly where he is. Played very well in the preseason, certainly earned his spot, and I do believe Matt Nelson will move back over to the right tackle, with, of course, Colby Sorsdale taking the right guard backup, and, of course, Graham Glasgow being the center and guard backups to that. Moving on to the defense, the edge position is pretty cut and dry as well. Aiden Hutchinson will make the roster alongside Charles Harris, John Kaminsky, Josh Pascal, and James Houston. The only questionable one here is going to be Romeo Okwara, a player that the last time he was fully healthy for a season came away with 10 sacks for the Detroit Lions, but hasn't been fully healthy in over 2 seasons. And we don't know how good he's going to be this year. Julian Okwara, I would argue, had a more impressive preseason, but Romeo Okwara has been healthier longer and has been more impactful in his time with Detroit. I do believe one of the Okwara brothers is unfortunately going to not make this roster, but if not, I do think that they could potentially either be claimed off of waivers or even traded for a small profit, probably a 6th to 7th round pick in exchange for one of the Okwara brothers. On the interior, I think that Aleem McNeil is going to make the roster, right? He slimmed down a lot. He is going to be the primary pass rusher for this team alongside Isaiah Buggs. Isaiah Buggs was kind of a standout free agent from last year, was a big-time playmaker for the Lions, and really did a good job anchoring the interior of that line. 3rd round pick Broderick Martin is a player that was double-teamed constantly in the preseason, ate up blocks and opened up rushing lanes for linebackers as well as blitzing defenders. He is a player that I think has a large development curve, but is going to get quite a lot of opportunity as the starting nose tackle, as he's really the only guy equipped to do that now. Levon Wuzariki was incredibly impressive in the preseason, getting constant pressure, constant hits on the quarterback, and constantly being in the backfield. He was double teamed. He was beating one-on-ones. He was making plays in the run game, making plays against the passage, and overall being arguably the most impressive interior lineman of the preseason. And then I think Broderick Jones And then I think Benito Jones stays as well. A really underrated impact player for the Lions defensive line last year, had a sack week 1 versus the New York Giants. I think he makes it as well as the 5th interior lineman. Now, linebacker, I think the Lions are going to carry 5. Last year they carried 4, but I do think they're going to try to use the talent around their linebacking core a little bit more this year and sub some of them in different packages. Jack Campbell, the first-round pick from Iowa, is of course going to be here, but Alex Anzalone will play alongside him. The team captain for 2 years reigning is not going anywhere after signing a 3-year, $18 million contract this past offseason. Malcolm Rodriguez, the rookie standout from a season ago, will of course make the roster alongside Derek Barnes, who by all reports has outplayed both Campbell and Rodriguez in camp and could eventually start week 1 alongside Alex Anzalone, at least in certain packages. Now, Jalen Reeves-Maybin had a very good preseason in his own right. He was able to make plays versus the pass as well as a pass rusher. He's a player that is kind of undersized, but has always been a very versatile special teams tool, and I do believe the Lions will keep him on the roster because I think if they waive him, I do believe he will get taken somewhere else. Even if they want to bring him back to the practice squad, I don't think that they're going to risk leaving JRM out there on waivers because he is a good enough special teams player and a good enough leader on that special teams unit to warrant keeping on the roster and, of course, not risking him being snatched from another franchise. Moving to the secondary, I think the Lions only carry 5 cornerbacks this year, that being Cam Sutton, Emmanuel Mosley, Jerry Jacobs, Will Harris, and Stephen Gilmore. Now, these are all players that I believe will play on the boundary with the exception of Will Harris. I think Will Harris is going to be your last resort player to play on the boundary. If anybody else can do it, he is going to be in the slot. But I do think Cam Sutton's a boundary corner. I do think Emmanuel Mosley is your boundary corner. I think Jerry Jacobs is a boundary guy, as is Stephen Gilmore. Even if they have slot versatility, I believe they will be used as outside cornerbacks primarily. Now, you might be asking, well, what about slot cornerbacks? And I included those with the safeties. The safety room includes Kirby Joseph, of course, the starter from last season and the playmaker second-year player from Illinois. You have CJ Gardner-Johnson, who will likely be either your safety or your starting nickelback. And if CJ is the starting safety, that means Brian Branch will likely be your starting slot cornerback. Both of them can kind of interchange based on what the defense needs, what the front looks like, what the plays are, and of course, what team you're playing any given week. Both of them have that position versatility to make plays as the slot cornerback or the deep safety. So I think they'll interchange that role pretty frequently, with Tracy Walker being the 4th man on that roster. The returning captain coming off a torn Achilles. Unfortunately, it seems as though his job has been taken, but the Lions do run a lot of 3 safety sets, so there is a good chance that Walker could see the field more than a typical 4th safety would, but that, of course, means the Detroit Lions have officially released or waived Ifeatu Melifonwu, the 3rd-round pick, and likely the 1st draft pick of Brad Holmes to be released from a roster. So that is very unfortunate, but we might see his name a little bit later. Going to the special teams, I think Parker Romo will win the job. From everything that we have seen, Parker Romo has been more consistent at camp. He's been more consistent from deep, as well as having the stronger leg as opposed to Riley Patterson. Yes, the Lions traded a 7th-round pick for Riley Patterson, but I think they're going to make the right decision and keep him on the roster. If not, I think that Parker Romo could eventually end up on the practice squad. Didn't play a whole lot in the season, so might not have too much interest from around the league. They might be able to waive him, stash him onto another practice squad, and keep 2 kickers around, but I do believe if it comes down to who you want to risk more, I think Parker Romo is probably the better option for the Detroit Lions as of right now. Although I do think this one could be easily switched with Riley Patterson and switch around their places in this order. Jack Fox will be the punter, of course, with the picture of him throwing the football, because that's what we all know Jack Fox for, as well as Scott Daly, the only long snapper on the roster, as the other competition was cut a couple weeks ago. Scott Daly will return as the Lions' starting long snapper. Now, let's take a look at the special teams. Chase Lucas, I think, should make the roster. I think he's very much good enough to make the roster, but I think that Stephen Gilmore had a much louder preseason. I think he's very much more in the eye of the media, in the eye of opposing NFL teams, whereas Chase Lucas is still looked at as a 7th-round pick, practice squad player from last year, and likely is he's less likely, in my opinion, to get poached from another team, as opposed to if Stephen Gilmore goes on the block. I think that he could potentially be taken, as he did have a loud offseason. He did have a couple big plays, and he was in the media a lot more than Chase Lucas was. I think Chase Lucas flies a little bit under the radar, could be elevated week after week as the 54th and 55th player. But will reside on the practice squad at least to start the season. Jermaine Ifedi is another player I think the Lions will bring back if he does not sign somewhere else. He was a pretty solid right tackle for the Detroit Lions, and of course, they need that offensive line depth. He may get taken away from another team, as offensive line depth is very hard to come across in the NFL, but if he is not, I do believe he will return as a Lion. Dylan Drummond, the player that was cut just a few minutes ago, I believe will return as a UDFA. Again, was great in practice, was great at rookie minicamp, was great at training camp, was great at OTAs, was really great throughout the entire offseason, except when the cameras were on and the lights were on, right? He didn't really have the biggest impact performance in game, which is why I think he's not going to be a hot commodity come the waiver wire, right? I don't think anybody's going to put in and risk their waiver order for Dylan Drummond, the undrafted rookie free agent that didn't get signed out of college, right? He showed up to rookie camp as a tryout, not as a signed UDFA player. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of interest from him. I think you can kind of sneak him onto the practice squad, keep the player that you really like, but of course, leave the opportunity and leave the roster spots open for the guys that had bigger off seasons and guys that have a little bit more work in the media. Maurice Alexander is another wide receiver I see returning to the Detroit Lions roster. Had a big kick return in week 1, is kind of the backup kick and punt returner, I do believe. And I think that they're going to try to stash him like they did last year. And if anything does happen to Cleve Freeman, hopefully it does not, we can have Maurice Alexander slide in as the kick and punt return specialist. Benny Snell was a late addition to the Lions preseason roster after running back Justin Jackson retired. I think he will make the practice squad. Again, you could interchange him with Jamar Jefferson. I think both of them are pretty good RB4s, but for this scenario, we will put Benny Snell on the practice squad. Corey Durden, very good player, had several pressures versus the Giants and Jaguars, and finally was able to get home versus the Carolina Panthers a few nights ago. He is a really young player that has quite a few tools to build around. I don't think there's enough spot on the defensive line for him right now, but I do think he will return on the practice squad. Again, kind of a quiet player in the preseason, shouldn't have too much hype around him, and should be a good player to stash away. Anthony Pittman, the longtime practice squad player, is a guy that will likely return. He doesn't have a spot at linebacker right now, but could have a depth spot at a special teams position. Again, another practice squad special teams player that could eventually be called up game after game. Starling Thomas and Brandon Joseph, I think, will both make the practice squad as well if they don't get signed away. Starling Thomas, I think there is a chance that he does eventually get snatched, but again, he didn't have the greatest preseason, at least not from a numbers standpoint, and I think kind of flying under the radar for anybody that's not a Detroit Lions fan, right? I think there's a better chance that an NFL team's looking at Stephen Gilmore to poach as opposed to Starling Thomas. And I think they are going to have a better opportunity to stash Starling Thomas on the practice squad as opposed to Stephen Gilmore, who will likely get taken by somebody else. Same thing with Brandon Joseph, right? There's not enough room for him at safety. I think that they could keep him if they want to maybe go a little lighter at other positions, but I think he played well enough to stay on the practice squad. I think he played well enough to remain a Detroit Lion, just not really good enough to beat out Tracy Walker and CJ Gardner-Johnson and Kirk Joseph and Brian Branch, because those players are really, really tough to beat out. Riley Patterson is the next member of the practice squad, the reliable kicker from inside of 40. Problem being, he's not as reliable from outside the 40. He doesn't have the biggest leg, doesn't really have the best resume from outside of 50 plus, and really needs to work on his distance. It's just kind of a physical limitation. He doesn't really have the leg for it, which is why I think he will get beat out, because when you need a game-winning kick from 50 plus, you have to reliably get a guy that can reliably kick it 50 yards. Now, I think that Trevor Nowaski is going to make the practice squad as well. Technically would make him the 7th linebacker on the roster. He had a very good preseason, got beaten coverage a couple times, but especially versus Carolina, I thought played a very good game, was the one that forced the fumble into the end zone. Kind of a skeptical play, but it went down as a forced fumble that went out of the back of the end zone for a touchback. He was the one that made that play in coverage and was able to get the Detroit Lions the football back. Not enough room for him on the active roster, but certainly a spot for him on the practice squad. Ifeatu Melifonwu, if not claimed off of waivers, if not signed somewhere else, and if not put on injured reserve, I do believe will be brought back. He's a player the Lions really like. He's a player the Lions very much believe in, but isn't a player that can consistently stay healthy or consistently play and make plays for your team. If he is healthy, I would expect him to be called up several times throughout the season as both a special teams player and a depth safety, but I don't think that your special team safety who's consistently injured is worthy of a roster spot over 4 guys that can realistically play a starting position at a very high level. Christian Covington, I think, could potentially return as a veteran presence, a guy that the Lions brought in early in training camp, a guy that probably had some work with developing Broderick Barton and some of the other young defensive linemen. Wasn't quite good enough to make the roster, but might not have a lot of interest and could want to return as a practice squad member. Benny Azee, despite his struggles in the preseason, still has a lot of physical gifts and still has a lot of high ceiling, coming out being a UDFA from TCU a season ago. Ended up making the practice squad, had some high ceilings, had some high hopes and expectations, didn't quite live up to them, which is why I think he will remain on the practice squad, but his physical traits cannot be denied. And then Trinity Benson is going to return. Like him or not, the Lions do like Trinity quite a lot. They traded for him in the first year of the Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell regime. And although he hasn't had the biggest impact in any game so far, not even the preseason, he's a player the Lions really like to have around. He's a player that just consistently sticks on this roster, kind of like Tom Kennedy, just not quite as good in the preseason. And I do believe he will return as the 15th member. That leaves one spot for the Detroit Lions to have another member of this roster. I think they're going to mix it up. I think they're going to go take a couple players from other rosters. They're going to take a look at the waiver wire. They're going to try to pick some guys up. And I think they're going to find a couple gems. They might move some guys around. Obeni Azee might get moved. I think Christian Covington might not stick around as long. But I think at least day one, as we kind of get around with cuts, as we kind of get around with waiver wire, and as we kind of see different players from different teams being waived, I do think this will be your starting 15 and your starting spots for the 2023 Detroit Lions. So with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about this squad. How good do you think this team can be in 2023 if the day one squad looks like this? And what players do you disagree with, right? What players do you think might make the roster over guys that I had? And how would you change this roster and build it differently than me? I'd be very curious what you guys have to say. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.